You break your hip today, and you call an ambulance. Someone stabilizes you. A surgeon replaces the joint. Within months, you're walking again. Your ancestors broke a hip, and they called nothing. No hospital, no wheelchair, no pension waiting for them at 65. So, what actually happened to them? For most of human history, growing old was never guaranteed. It was a gamble your body had to win against hunger, cold, infection, and time itself. And yet, against almost every assumption you might carry about primitive life, the archaeological record tells a strange and unexpected story. Ancient humans did not always abandon their elderly. Sometimes, against brutal odds, they carried them. Let's start with a skeleton. In 1908, 3 French clergymen digging in a limestone cave called La Chapelle-aux-Saints unearthed the remains of a Neanderthal man who lived roughly 60,000 years ago. The paleontologist Marcelin Boule studied the bones and found something remarkable. This man's spine was warped by arthritis. His jaw had lost nearly all its teeth, years before he died. His hip was degenerated to the point that walking must have been agony every single day. How does a toothless, arthritic man survive in a world with no soft food, no medicine, and no mercy from the landscape? He doesn't. Not alone. Someone had to chew his food for him, or mash it, or feed him something soft enough for his ruined mouth to manage. Someone had to slow the group's pace for him again and again for years. That is not neglect. That is a decision, repeated daily, by people who had every reason to leave him behind and didn't. This wasn't an isolated case. Around the same era, in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iraq, a Neanderthal skeleton known as Shanidar I was excavated in the 1950s by the archaeologist Ralph Selecki. This individual was blind in one eye, missing part of a forearm, and showed signs of a limp that would have made hunting nearly impossible. He still lived to what was, for a Neanderthal, an old age. Decades with a disability, in an ice-age landscape, surrounded by predators far stronger than he was. That does not happen by accident. That happens because a group made room for him. So here's the reframe you need to sit with. You've probably heard the phrase, survival of the fittest, applied to prehistoric life, like it means only the strongest individuals made it, and everyone else got left in the dirt. But fitness, in evolutionary terms, was never really about individual strength. It's about whatever traits help a group persist across generations. And it turns out, one of the most powerful survival strategies humans ever developed wasn't muscle. It was memory. It was care. Why would a small band of hunter-gatherers, constantly moving, constantly short on food, choose to carry someone who could no longer hunt, dig, or carry a child on their back? The answer starts with what elders actually offered a group, and it is not what you'd expect from someone who can no longer physically contribute. The anthropologist Kristen Hawkes spent years studying the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer people in Tanzania, and developed what is now known as the grandmother hypothesis. Her research showed that older women, well past their reproductive years, were often the most productive foragers in the entire camp. They dug tubers for hours without tiring the way younger mothers did. They gathered food with decades of accumulated knowledge about exactly where the land gave the most for the least effort. Critically, they fed their grandchildren, which freed the children's mothers to wean earlier and have more children sooner. An elder wasn't a mouth to feed for nothing. She was an engine that quietly kept the whole group's birth rate and survival rate climbing, year after year. Knowledge itself was the other currency an elder carried, and in a world without writing, it was priceless. Before books, before the internet, before any way to store information outside a human skull, everything a person knew died the moment they did. An elder who remembered where the water held out during the worst drought in 30 years, or which plant healed a wound, and which one silently killed you within a day, was carrying something the entire tribe's survival depended on. You couldn't look it up. You had to keep the person alive long enough to ask. The researcher Polly Wiesner documented this directly among the Jew/Hwanzi people of the Kalahari Desert, recording night after night how elders sat as the primary storytellers around the fire, passing down not just practical information, but the social rules, the history of old feuds and alliances, and the moral lessons that held the entire group together. Take away the elder, and you don't just lose one person. You lose the group's memory, its only working archive. This pattern shows up far beyond Africa. The researchers Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan spent years compiling survival data across dozens of hunter-gatherer and forager-horticulturalist societies, from the Hadza to the Tsaimene of the Bolivian Amazon. Their findings showed something that surprised even seasoned anthropologists. Once a person survived early childhood, a brutal filter in itself, they had a real chance of living into their 60s or 70s, even without modern medicine. Old age was not some rare fluke of prehistoric life. It was a normal expected stage of the human lifespan, common enough that societies had to build systems around it, not just hope it wouldn't happen. That matters because it means elder care wasn't an occasional emergency a tribe stumbled into once a generation. It was a recurring, predictable part of group life, the same way raising infants was. And just like infant care, it shaped how these groups organized themselves, moved, and divided labor. Younger, stronger members hunted and carried loads. Elders processed food, minded children, repaired tools, and held the accumulated memory of the group. Every age group paid rent in a different currency, and the currency of the old was knowledge and stability. Now picture it. It's dusk on the savannah. The sky has gone deep orange behind a lone acacia tree. The hunters have returned with meat, but not quite enough to feel safe. An old woman sits close to the fire, her hands too stiff now to dig for roots the way she once could for hours without stopping. But she's talking. She's describing the winter, 40 years earlier, when the rivers dried to nothing and half the neighboring camps starved. Every person around that fire is listening, because that exact story might be the thing that saves their life someday. In a drought none of them have lived through yet. She isn't dead weight sitting by that fire. She is the group's map, its warning system, its insurance policy against disasters her own body can no longer help her survive. Here's the twist, though, and it's an uncomfortable one that ruins any clean, comforting version of this story. This kind of care was never universal, and it was never unconditional. Some anthropological accounts of nomadic groups under extreme environmental stress, particularly in brutally cold or resource-starved environments like the Arctic, describe elders who chose, or were expected, to stay behind when a group had to move fast to survive an oncoming winter. This was rarely framed as cruelty for its own sake. In many recorded cases, it was described as a final decision made by the elder themselves, a last act of contribution to a group that simply could not carry everyone across the ice. Ancient life did not run on sentimentality alone. It ran on brutal, unforgiving arithmetic, and sometimes that arithmetic turned even against the people a tribe most respected and needed. So the real truth isn't a simple story of either total abandonment or total devotion. It's both, shifting with the season, the landscape, and how thin the margins were that particular year. Care for elders wasn't a moral rule handed down from nowhere, floating above human survival like an ideal. It was a strategy, refined and retested across hundreds of thousands of years, that groups leaned on heavily when they could afford it, and reluctantly abandoned only when the alternative was losing everyone. And this is where it should start to feel uncomfortably close to home. You live in a world of retirement homes and understaffed care facilities, where growing old often means slowly becoming invisible, moved out of the daily rhythm of family life and into a separate building, on a separate schedule, in a separate conversation from everyone younger. Your ancestors fought exhaustion, starvation, and predators just to keep a toothless, arthritic old man alive at Chapelle-aux-Saints, because his presence and his knowledge were judged worth every extra ounce of effort it cost the group. What does it say that you, with abundance and medicine and technology your ancestors could never have dreamed of, sometimes struggle to make that same case? Maybe the real inheritance from your ancestors was never a hunting technique or a fire-starting trick passed down through generations. Maybe it's this quieter instinct, buried somewhere under 60,000 years of survival, that a group is only ever as strong as its willingness to slow down and carry the ones who can no longer keep pace on their own. You break your hip today, and you call an ambulance. But somewhere underneath that simple modern act is a much older story, written into caves and old bones, about who gets carried, who gets left, and why that choice has never once been easy. Next time you sit across from someone old in your own life, someone slower now, someone who repeats a story you've already heard, remember what that story actually is. It's not filler. It's not decline. Somewhere in it is exactly the kind of information a body around a fire once needed to survive a winter it hadn't seen yet. 60,000 years later, you are still, in a much quieter way, deciding who gets carried.